Right, hi everyone. I'm Amber Henry. I'm a project manager for Morphed. I should just point out I'm not a content strategist or a copywriter, so you might be wondering why I'm talking about writing for government websites today. And it's come from working web development most of my career, and majority of that's been in the government and not-for-profit sector. So I'm really aware of creating accessible digital products for all users and abilities, which also includes the content itself. So today I'm going to be covering a few topics and approaches to achieving website content for all users. I'm just going to sort of briefly cover some of the key points from the Digital Experience Policy and Australian Government Style Manual. A little survey that we did looking at some of the top government websites and how they're currently doing. A case study on a recent project, and then finally I'll finish off with some few tools to help validate and improve your content. So starting off with the DTA's new Digital Experience Policy, or DX policy. The policy sets important standards of how government websites and digital services should perform, ensuring they deliver user-friendly and accessible experiences. The policy establishes performance benchmarks for whole of government digital services, helping agencies design user-centred experiences. I'm not going to go into detail of all the standards, but just quickly cover that there's 4 standards, and I've put a QR code up on here which will take you to the site so that you can see the full overview. Each standard has a set of criterions, and on the site they explain each criterion, and there's resources and guidelines on how you should implement those. So there's a digital service standard which outlines the essential guidelines for designing and delivering digital services for government. The digital access standard, which outlines the requirements for agencies to make informed decisions and minimise duplicate entry points to government digital services. The data inclusion standard, which defines the requirements for creating inclusive and accessible digital government experiences. And the digital performance standard, which outlines the approach of monitoring digital performance across government services and supporting data-driven decisions. So government agencies need to understand all these new standards and be across which ones may or may not apply to them. Now, the Australian Government Style Manual provides guidance in a number of areas, and most agencies will be very familiar with these guidelines. So the following sections that are relevant to my presentation today is reading level, culturally sensitive inclusion, plain language, and consistent tone of voice. There is a QR code up on the screen again for you, so this will take you through to the style manual for the full overview. So a large focus this presentation is on the reading levels of content on government websites and ways to improve the site's content for a range of digital and literacy levels for the general public. The recommended reading level is of a Year 7 student, which is 12 to 14 years of age. So how do we measure this reading score? Traditionally, reading scores levels would be measured using the Flesch-Kincaid method. So what is Flesch-Kincaid? It's a score of 0 to 100, which provides a measure of how complex the writing level is for a given piece of content. This is a mathematical equation. The equation calculates the relationship between the number of syllables to the number of words in a sentence and to the number of sentences in a paragraph. So simpler pieces of content will score higher. So following the style manual, the government says we should aim for a Year 7 reading level, so we're looking at a score between 70 and 80. So now we're going to have a quick look at an evaluation Morphed recently did, looking at widely used Australian government sites to find out their reading score level. So we evaluated 15 sites and ranked them based on their Flesch reading scores. I won't disclose the specific sites, but they do represent a large, also a range of sectors, as health, services and finance. And for consistency, we analysed standard pages found on most sites, like your homepage, about, accessibility terms, privacy policy, articles, and so on. So we used a third-party tool to get these reading score levels, which were outputted using the flesh method. So having a look at the results, the overall average score of was 60.40, so indicating that the content was suited to like Year 8, Year 9 level. And of the 15 sites, only one actually reached the Year 7 benchmark of 70 or above, scoring 72. 7 sites fell within the 60 to 70 range, and 5 scored below 60. So the results indicate that the majority of the sites are simplifying their language and making, I think, a conscious effort to make content more accessible, but very few sites are meeting that overall average score of 70 or above. This is based on the Flesch-Kincaid method. So as the Australian Government Style Manual says, readability is more than a number. I showed you earlier the Flesch-Kincaid table for all the different score levels, and that this is a mathematical equation, which may highlight that your content needs some improvement, but doesn't necessarily make your content more readable. So the style manual suggests to avoid over-editing your content just to achieve a better reading score. Stick to the basics of using plain language and consistent tone of voice, and focus on the structure of your content. So now I'm going to run through a few of the tools. So I will do that soon. First, I'm going to share a case study. Morph recently worked on a project for a government agency, and it had the requirement to read a Year 7 reading level. So what did we discover during the project? So through user research, we identified 5 key audiences, which is quite a large number of audiences for a site. And these audiences ranged from users seeking help and information and may have low and/or literacy levels, or English as a second or even third language. The other end of the audiences was sort of highly educated academics, subject matter experts, and government. Keeping in mind we had to create content to reach a Year 7 level, it also had to remain meaningful and factual, especially around legislation and laws. So what we found while going through the validation process of all this content, that it was actually very hard to get it to a flash, score of 70 to 80, which is the Year 7 reading level. So we returned sort of looking back at the audiences. And on the site, this was quite clearly broken down through the navigation and focused on the sections for each audience on the site. So the audiences that were likely to be the users seeking help and information or wanting to help somebody else, we aimed to get the highest reading score possible. And on average, the site was scoring at 72. So we were meeting that Year 7 reading level score. And then while the other audiences that, were sort of academics, frontline workers, subject matter experts, who were most likely seeking information on current legislation or the government's response, we accepted that the reading score could be lower because the content still had to remain factual, not misleading. Circling back to the results I showed earlier on the government surveys. Initially looking at those results, it doesn't look like maybe the government sites aren't doing so well, but I think we're looking at those average overall scores, and even just with the case study I went through, I then went back and looked at these particular sites and their audience sections on the site and could see that those audiences, those sort of content areas for audiences with like lower literacy or digital levels had much higher average reading scores and were meeting that sort of 70 or above sort of target. And again, the areas of the site that were targeted towards, more highly educated subject matter experts were scoring lower, which was then giving that overall average, bringing that overall score down. So this aligns with what the style manual is telling us, is that, readability is more than a number, and that we really need to write for our audience and know our audience. And that, government agencies also need some flexibility around this, that it's not just trying to meet a particular reading score number as well. Because it's very hard to get the content to that level without it being misleading, confusing, or no longer factual for the users. So now I'm going to run through some of the tools that I've used on projects to achieve better results for accessible and meaningful content. Some of these I personally use daily, and some of them have been already talked about a few times today, and I'm sure they will continue in the conference. So just quickly, here's just a QR code for a Flesch Kincaid calculator. This is just a free one online. There's quite a few out there. So I won't go into it too much detail because I've already talked about it, but running your content through the calculator, if you do have certain requirements to meet, is still sort of useful to kind of get a benchmark of where your content may be at. Next is the sort of free writing assistants like Grammarly and Hemingway, which can improve readability by suggesting clearer language and correcting grammar. Microsoft Word also has this functionality, which is commonly used across government agencies. I'm sort of focusing on Grammarly here as it's the tool that I mainly use, and like the pro versions do offer extra functionality with AI writing assistance and additional settings for, where you can select accessibility levels and tone of voice, and Hemingway does that as well. I've also found that comparing the reading scores, running it through the Flesch calculator versus Hemingway or Grammarly, the reading scores in these apps are a bit more generous. And I would believe that that's based on the fact that they're actually taking the content as a whole and the readability, the structure of the content, as opposed to just the mathematical equation that, the Flesch method uses. So then we've got generative AI tools. Like ChatGPT and Gemini, and quite a few others out there, which are very useful for writing content, especially if you're not a content copywriter like me. So they're being used everywhere now for many reasons, many tasks, and also being, well integrated into Drupal 11 now, which will be really, I think, a great addition for content authors. So I'm focusing on ChatGPT here as my example. Just because it's mainly what I use, so I don't want to sort of promise how some of the other apps may work. So when using AI tools, it's all about getting your prompts right for the purpose of what you're doing or asking, and it can take a few goes, as I'm sure you're all aware by now. So I'm going to run through an example using ChatGPT and Grammarly to improve the readability of an article. So for the example, I've used a Morph blog post, which was, our audience are generally aimed at an industry level, sort of subject matter experts that would, understand our technical jargon that may be in those articles. So, certainly not trying to necessarily meet this government level, but so I first copied the article into Grammarly, accepted any suggestions, and the reading level came back at 59, which is a Year 9 level. I then copied the article back into ChatGPT and used this following prompt to rewrite the following to use simple, clear, concise, inclusive, non-threatening language suitable for a 12 to 14-year-old. Keep sentences under 15 words in length and try to include up to 3 sentences when writing a paragraph. So copying the results back into Grammarly, the article now has a reading level of 66, which is a Year 8 level. So this particular, example is just running through how you can use these two tools to improve, content that's already been created. This next example is creating a blog post from scratch. So here I've got a prompt that, there's a lot of guides online. This one's from Ryan Robertson, who he writes a lot of guides on AI prompts for sort of blogging and marketing, and it's sort of one that I've, played around with and used a bit. So I'm just using it here as the example. I won't read the whole thing out because it's quite long, as you can see. The key points is that, you need to sort of set the style or tone of your article. We've got the create a blog post on the topic. So in here, I've just inserted DTA, digital experience policy, and for the audience, I inserted content authors. So ChatGPT goes ahead, writes our article, certainly seems to capture all the sort of main points of the DX policy, it's broken it down using, subheadings and lists and things to make the content sort of easy to follow. However, when I put it into Grammarly, the reading score is 35. So I go back to ChatGPT and I use my following prompt that I just showed you before, asking it to sort of rewrite it, suitable for a 12 to 14-year-old. Pop it back into Grammarly, and we're now at 68. So both of these examples, was certainly more for a higher educated audience when they first began, managed to, using some prompts in ChatGPT and Grammarly's suggestions as well, to improve that reading score, to sort of get closer to that mark of like the general public being able to understand these articles. But it's also really important to, cover the, content coming out of any AI app. You still, as the content author, really need to check that, make sure it's, factual, because obviously it's pulling information from everywhere, and that it's using your own tone of voice, the style, and it still has the messages that you want to relay. So while these tools can certainly aid us and, maybe speed up the process or help people that, aren't copywriters trying to do these sorts of things, there's still an element of, customization and work to be done. So here we are at the conclusion, which is all about authoring better content. In general, what I've gone through today applies to any agency or business, not just government. But as mentioned, government agencies may have more of a requirement to hit certain reading level scores. So just having a look at the key takeaways that we can all practice to make more inclusive, accessible content. We've got know your audience. So government websites serve diverse user groups, including people with varying literacy levels, cultural backgrounds and abilities. And it's crucial to understand your audience's needs and expectations early on in the process. Plan and structure your content. Content for government websites should be well organised and easy to navigate. Begin by outlining the key messages and goals of the content. Use headings, subheadings, and lists to break up information into digestible sections. Write in plain language. Government content should always be accessible to a wide audience, including those with lower literacy levels, and writing in plain language ensures clarity. This means using short, simple sentences, avoiding jargon and technical terms unless necessary, and providing explanations when used, and using an active voice to make content more direct and easy to understand. And maintaining consistency in tone, style, and terminology across a website is crucial. Validate and test your readability. So once the content is drafted, assess its readability using tools, as some of the ones I've mentioned today. Aim for a Year 7 reading level, but ensure that the content still remains readable. And if possible, testing content with users from diverse backgrounds, varying digital and literacy levels and abilities. And thank you. So I don't think there's an awful lot of time, but if anyone has a quick question, No, we don't. Yes, Mary.
When you ran it through ChatGPT, you got the new version out of the improved score. How did you find the content? Did you find that the meaning of the article was intact and it sort of survived that transformative process?
So the question was how I felt the content was after running it through ChatGPT. So the first example, which was an article that has already been written and published, and used the more simpler prompt, I found it didn't change too much of that article. It was just, probably just helping with shorter sentences and maybe some of the jargon or things like that. Writing the article from scratch, it was quite different. I think, personally, like if I was to publish that article, I would have probably edited that quite a bit in Grammarly before publishing it. But, it sort of gave, I guess, a starting point. And you could see that the level was, it's, 68, 8 was very close to meeting that sort of Year 7 reading level, so it was, potentially a good starting point. Yeah.
The guidelines, they're the federal government, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Do you know if they mandate that for all jurisdictions, or is that?
I don't know actually. Yeah.
So, for example, New South Wales government has its own set of standards, but they're all sort of pretty much modelled off the federal government standards, in my understanding. Yeah.
I should know this.
So should I.
But can I just ask, so you're using ChatGPT, but you're also using mainly Grammarly, not Hemingway?
Mainly Grammarly, yeah.
So Hemingway, and I assume Grammarly, because I haven't really played with it, when you load the content in there, it can give you recommendations to simplify sentences.
Yep.
When would you pump things into ChatGPT, and when would you just do tweaking, like in your opinion, right? Do tweaking
Yep.
in Grammarly or Hemingway?
So the question was, I'll have to try and remember that, using...
When would you use the tools to tweak, or when would you use ChatGPT to kind of re-manifest?
Okay, yeah. Writing from scratch, I'm using Grammarly so that I'm taking on the suggestions as I'm writing, just so that it's my voice. Then sort of checking it in ChatGPT and seeing what those improvements could be, but then I guess making that decision of whether those improvements suit what I want my article's message to be, as using this as an example.
So you're writing new content, some of the work that I've been doing recently has been rewriting content that government has produced several years ago and not released it, and coming back to it to try and get it back to a reading level. So it's a slightly different information.
Okay. Oh, whenever you're here.
From Vic Government, we just released something about the guidelines for using generative AI. Does the Australian government have a policy or restrictions there on plugging government content into an AI tool?
That I probably cannot answer just because I'm... Yes, that'd be great.
It's kind of like if you're plugging in something that's already been published, it's in the public domain. So, okay. You can fix already published stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of groups who don't want to use that. It's supposed to probably an agency part of the next control, so in my area, there are a lot of groups. But I think they'll change it.
Okay.
Hey, when it comes to writing brand new content, taking user needs into consideration is something we all probably see as crucial. What are common approaches your team might take when you're testing brand new content to make sure it's understandable what your end user is trying to achieve?
I suppose most of our content is sort of, I guess, more industry-related articles, and I guess about our products and services. So that's more through an internal review, I would say. We make a conscious effort to create our own content. So even though I gave an example of, say, creating content just, from using AI, it's sort of not the practice that we necessarily follow. We use it more for maybe just checking and rewriting, yeah. Yes.
So when you put up the Instagram there, I thought it was going to be a really pessimistic story about how government was doing, but then you said that when you went back and looked at the audience, it was actually a better story. So is the conclusion that the Australian government is actually doing pretty well from what you understand?
Yeah, from the sites that we sort of ran the test through, I think it just was, at first it was like, oh, okay, this isn't too good. But then looking at the audiences and breaking that down on the site, you could, similar to the case study, a lot of those sections of the site, the scores were in the 70s and 80s as, I guess is that level that government sites are trying to meet. So, it actually, I think, the results ended up being a lot better than what you sort of firstly see. Yep.
How do you feel about the practice of having a web page that is not necessarily at a lower reading level or a higher score reading level, and then having an easy read document accompanying it?
That's a good question. Well, I think probably I'd imagine it'd be very hard to have your easy read document for a high level reading page. It would be quite big potentially, but I think you would still need to really focus on that content being readable for, I guess, as that higher score as you possibly can, even if it does have an easy read document with it.
I think the challenge is going to be the title of the page. Because if the title of the page is language is so hard to get through, that door will get you into that easy read anyway. So if you're not doing that properly, then what's going to be drawing over that sort of easy.
That's a good point.
Yep.
A common blocker I would say I find is legalese. Is a lot of times when we create content for a page, and we want to simplify language, we're blocked by legal terms or legal jargon we have to include, which can affect that readability score. Do you have any recommendations or approaches on how to kind of consult or work with, organisational areas that have that kind of influence and how to kind of come to a more readable approach?
Yeah, you sort of really need the subject matter experts in that team to really review that and to make sure it's factual and not misleading. And that's what we found in our project. It did take, those SMEs really had to review that content, even though we were trying to get that level higher up. We just, it became a level where we just couldn't, because they couldn't, I suppose it's their content, but that's where we started using the terms. So I did sort of point that out. So when jargon does need to be used, is giving the examples using sort of some simpler words of what that term means to help people out.
You're going to have to wrap it up, folks. We've got the panel next. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.